We've talked about the three diminished chords, earth, wind, and fire. We've talked about the spaces they fill within a tonal center. A diminished can take on a different quality depending on where it is within a key, and we call those qualities mind, body, and spirit. Now we're going to talk about the three ways a diminished chord, or notes from a diminished chord, can travel. The actual concept here is pretty straightforward and can be understood very basically, so I'll try not to over-explain it. That way, we can instead use more time to hear the application of this knowledge in examples. Cool, here we go. Let's take a look at our circle diagram that we've been using. In this diagram, we have three spaces where diminished chords live, and in between them, we have spaces where other types of chords live. Now, for any given diminished chord, there are three of those in-between spaces that it can move to. It can move directly across the circle to the space on the opposite side. It can move clockwise, or it can move counterclockwise. So there are three paths a diminished can take to resolve. Let's use mind, body, spirit in this diagram and put tonic, mimic, and lenient in these in-between spaces. Now we can hear what these movements sound like. First, we'll take a look at each path moving to tonic. Okay, let's now define these three movements more specifically. First, we'll look at the counterclockwise path. When a diminished moves to the chord counterclockwise from it, we'll call that perch. The reason being because the notes that move in this resolution go up a half step and perch onto the note or notes of this chord. For example, if we're resolving from here to here, D flat will move up to D, and E up to F. The symbol even looks like a perch, a place where a bird could land. Now let's look at the opposite side, clockwise motion. If we move from this diminished this time, a similar thing happens but in the opposite direction and places. This time, the notes of this diminished will sink into the notes of this chord by a half step, and they'll sink into the other two notes of the quadrant. This movement will be called plum, because I imagine that we're taking the notes of a diminished and pressing the notes down to be plum, resulting in a chord from the space clockwise to it. Also, the symbol for this movement is supposed to be a little fruit because plum sounds like plum. Okay, lastly, we have the across diminished. It's the only movement from a diminished space to one of these compound spaces where all the notes move. So if we resolve to the same chord from before, every note in this chord will move so that we can have our new chord. Some of the notes might move a half step, some might move by a whole step. I call this movement pierce. 1, because it cuts through the middle of the circle. 2, because I imagine this diminished being like an arrow that can hit every object it's targeting. Because again, every note moves from this diminished to this space. That's why the symbol for this resolution is meant to look like the fletching of an arrow. I want to stress that last point. In this path, every note can move, because a diminished doesn't share any notes in common with any chords that come out of this space across from it. And that isn't true with the previous two paths we talked about. In a perch or plum path, you'll see 1, 2, or 3 notes in common with the chord you're moving to. Okay, cool. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's hear and discuss some examples. Alright, let's take a look at the changes of the tune Slow Boat to China. I'm going to play it in a weird key, but all you really need to pay attention to is the relationships of the chords and how those diminished move. Okay, so here we go. So we start on tonic, and then this diminished, which is fire, it goes to a sand chord, which doesn't have any notes in common with this diminished. And like we said before, Pierce movement is the only diminished movement where none of the notes are in common. So that first diminished is piercing that mimic chord, in this case E flat minor 7 or G flat major 6, however you want to think about it. Okay, and then the next chord, wind diminished this time. Now I was playing like the 3 chord after that, you know. So if we're playing 3, if we're thinking about that diminished resolving to 3, then the resolution is another piercing motion. But if you're thinking about it as resolving to tonic and instead playing this, slightly different. It's a subtle difference, but in this movement, only 2 of the notes are changing, and they're moving upward by a half step. So that is a perch. You're perching onto tonic. So and then perch onto tonic, or you could pierce onto lenient. Just depends on how you're moving the notes, basically. And then after that, after you go to that 3 minor 7, there's this 3 dominant chord, and if you're playing it as a flat 9, it contains this diminished, which then moves clockwise into the 2 chord or the 4 chord, the E flat minor 7. Alright, before we talk about this song too long, let's move on. Alright, how about this? So that is using diminished chords. So first, we're falling on to tonic, so that is a plum resolution, and then we're coming at it from the other side with a pierce resolution. So we plum and we pierce that tonic chord for that, you know, that little harmony line. So this diminished right here, oops, that resolution is taking 2 notes and lowering them. So if we were to be looking at the circle diagram, we would see that we're taking the mind diminished and moving it into the mimic chord, okay? Basically, we're falling onto 2 from diminished notes above. Okay, the first movement is just piercing tonic. So we play tonic. You know, if I sing the melody, that's all I did was pierce tonic. pierce tonic however you want to make melodies, but that's the motion that's happening during that part of the song. Sure, you can think about it as 1, 3 dominant to 6, but the fact of the matter is that dominant chord has the pierce diminished within it for the next chord it's moving to. So really, I just look at it like I'm playing one chord and then I'm piercing that very same chord before I really move. You know, okay, let's move on. For the next one, I'll show you this little chord melody that I play on Vie En Rose. So right there, I mean, I did some other stuff too, but this is the one I want to point out. I'm playing the mind diminished in this key and resolving it to tonic. So that is a perching resolution. It sounds cool just because I used the melody note in that spot, which is borrowed from a different diminished. So I'm playing the mind diminished and borrowing a spirit note, just because that's the melody. So again. Same thing there, I used the very same chord, but that time moving it to the mimic, which is on the opposite side of it. I resolved it to the other side. So before it was mind going to tonic, now it's mind going to mimic, which is clockwise. The first time I was perching, but the second time I'm falling plum onto that next chord. I could have pierced that 2 chord in some way, but it doesn't quite work because of the melody note is a B. So I would need to, I couldn't play this fully diminished to pierce to this chord. I would need to borrow, which is okay, that sounds fine. Maybe that sounds a little bit cool. I just happen to like that for whatever reason. But you could totally think, okay, I'm going to pierce to this chord, but I have to borrow a note because of what the melody is. You could think like that, you know? We should be able to fluidly move a diminished chord in any direction because all of the flavors are cool. And there are situations that are appropriate for all of those movements. And you could really use them wherever. It doesn't matter if it's like appropriate or not. As long as you do it the right way because you've learned how to move those things, you can use them. Perch, plum, pierce. All right, everyone. I think we've covered the topic well enough to be able to stop here. This is the last video in the series of 3. The 3 paths is this one. Then we had the 3 essences before that, and the 3 elements was first. They are related, but I hope you can see how they're distinct enough to be useful each in their own right. So yeah, take some time to study this concept and see how you can move diminished chords in different ways to get different flavors of resolution and movement. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you have not subscribed, and always leave me any thoughts or comments that you might have down below. All right, see you in the next one.